It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes. And today we will be looking at new updates to the antitrust cases, Dana White's comments about UFC fighter reactions to Conor Benn's purse, Eddie Hearn's new talent agency, what fighters can do if they don't like their pay, the Zuffa Boxing kerfuffle with the IBF, Francis Ngannou's PFL release and subsequent booking on the Rousey versus Carano card, and more. But if you want access to all of that, you're going to need to pick up a paid subscription, because for all of you out there that are familiar with us, you already know that about half of this will be behind a paywall. So for all the new people out there, you're going to want to subscribe so that you can get the stuff that's behind the paywall. Now, I know we had just one show last week, but we're back on track this week because John is finally home and reunited with beloved Isla the kitty cat. John, how the heck are you?
Good. It was an eventful last few days. I did not watch UFC 326. I had to spend a couple days with my girlfriend because I hadn't seen her for a while, and then I had just hell trying to get back to LA because my flight got postponed, and then so over like a day and a half later. So finally back today. This morning, just a few hours ago, got back in LA. And you know, the amount of travel it takes to go from the airport to here. So I got back to my place a little over an hour ago. So that's how dedicated I am to bringing you this stuff that we're going to talk about. And on top of that, I have my cat on my lap because she will not leave me the F alone since I got back.
And John doesn't tell y'all this, but I was egging him on to do the show tonight because there has been so much news that I've been itching to talk about it. And this is the place for the news and for the reactions and for John's expert analysis on things. And so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. And as always, we start off our shows with any updates that may have transpired in the UFC antitrust cases. John, were there any?
Yes, there was a court order that came out today, which I almost missed because, you know, I fly Sun Country and Sun Country doesn't have internet access as you're flying, which I kind of like because I get to read. I travel back and forth to Minnesota about once a month, almost once every other month. So I get to, my one time I get to read, but I almost missed this. So I looked it up. There was a court order that came out today, and it's involving the plaintiffs in the antitrust suits. For new listeners, because we seem to be always adding a few every episode, the antitrust case, the UFC antitrust cases, the current ones are Johnson v. Zuffa, Serkinov v. Zuffa, and Davis v. Zuffa. So it's involving them and a third party called Dominance MMA. So that's what we're going to talk about. That was the court order. What the court order was, this third party Dominance MMA, the court made an order that they must hand over all collected responsive material by April 3rd, 2026, or face contempt and financial sanctions. So we got an answer about the sanctions that finally came down. They must disclose all devices. That includes models of the phones, phone numbers, dates of use belonging to their custodians. Those are the key people in the company that would handle information. By March 17th, 2026, so we're talking next week, will likely be ordered to pay plaintiffs attorney fees and costs due to their failure to comply with discovery obligations. And the plaintiffs have until April 5th, 2026 to file a motion calculating those fees. And then there will be the court also ordered an independent court expert. They are appointing an Eric Woodin of Kroll as an independent forensic expert under Rule 706. Both sides will have to split the costs of this. Defense counsel, that's Dominance Defense Counsel, must provide an inventory of relevant devices along with passwords. Apparently, they're not going to have that password shit anymore after the UFC. And I don't know what this is. There was no explanation, but IMEI numbers by March 10th, 2026. And both parties must submit proposed instruction for the expert by March 13th, 2026, after which the court will arrange a call to set the scope of the forensic review. And then there's some ongoing discovery disputes that were part of the order. Both sides must meet and confer regarding subpoenas issued to 5 individuals. And this part I should talk about is not with dominance. This involves the plaintiffs, the fighters we mentioned, their suits, and the defendants being basically the UFC. And so the 5 individuals are Tracy Long, Dana White, Hunter Campbell, Mick Maynard, and Denitsa Bachvarova. And they must consent to their mobile carriers releasing metadata. And the defendants also have until March 21st, 2026 to collect and process devices for 30 additional custodians that had been previously approved by the court. And then the sanction motion briefing schedule, plaintiffs may amend their sanction motion within 30 days of the expert completing his review. The defendants then have 2 weeks to respond and the plaintiffs 1 week to reply. So if you add that together, that's 30 days from now, and then 2 and 3. So we are talking sometime in May, we will get an idea of the judges. We should have an idea at that point what the judge is going to do about sanctions of the defendants, being the UFC. And then there's a joint status report. Both parties must file a joint status report by April 14, 2026, covering all the ongoing discovery disputes, search term negotiations, and whether a separate digital message repository exists under litigation hold. So that was what the court ordered. So we got some answers on some stuff, and we will see how that will unfold.
I was wondering if you could back up for me and tell me the thing about the IMEI number again.
Well, it says that the council must provide an inventory of relevant devices along with the passwords and IMEI numbers.
The IMEI number. Wow. Okay. That is like the unique number that's assigned to each phone from the carrier. And what they can do with that is they can get instant info on the device's status, SIM locks, the specs, literally any and everything associated with that phone can be obtained through that number. So they are not messing around.
Wow. Well, now I know what I have to. Is there any way I can destroy that or hide that just for curiosity's sake? Not that I have to do that with my phones.
That's a trip. I mean, they are really, really going hard in the paint here. I love it. I love it. I love it. So let's move on because we got word on Conor Benn's reported $15 million purse a little over a week ago. I mean, we briefly brushed on it, I believe, last week. But since then, UFC fighters have been voicing their annoyance here, there, and everywhere. We had Kenny Florian made a tweet. Max Holloway gave an interview where he talked about it. Israel Adesanya talked about it. Sugar Sean O'Malley talked about it. Aljamain Sterling talked about it. Who out of those did you find particularly interesting or insightful?
Well, I think by far the most interesting and insightful of all of them was Aljamain Sterling, because it's, he gave some of the most accurate descriptions of what the situation is for fighters, what the environment of the industry is, that I've heard any fighter give. In fact, I'm kind of straining my brain thinking who has given a more accurate description. I can't think of one. And I'm going to quote one specific section he talked about, which I think summed it up. And he said, "You'll see a lot of guys bitching and complaining about it. You'll hear a lot of people saying, well, you signed the contract. You negotiated this. There is no negotiating. Why do you guys keep thinking that? You want to be here or not, and that's why I'm okay. I'm okay with being here because there's no other place for us to go. So when you have only one option, you do your job as best as you can and hope to continue to make more money as best as you can, and hopefully make as much money as you can outside of fighting. And that's the best advice I can give to these guys, because again, these guys, these fighters, they're not going to get out of their way to want to band together to make a change, to make a stance. Hoorah. These guys aren't going to do that. It's a very selfish sport. The business model is going to be this business model for as long as I can foresee it, because it takes and starts with the fighters to want to make a change, right? And that kind of, I mean, I thought it really summed it up, because he kind of explained, people are always like, you signed the contract. Well, it's a take it or leave it contract. It's not like you have a choice in the contract you sign. And are you happy to be in the UFC? Of course he's happy in the UFC, because there's no other options. And this was, I thought, the best, the most aware I've ever heard a fighter be about this. Maybe not the most aware, but one of the most aware of this current wave of fighters talking about Conor Benn. This seems to be the most aware I've seen of a fighter recently, and specifically in this new round of complaints ever since the Conor Benn payout people became aware of that. And so I thought that was particularly interesting, particularly worthwhile. And so I would definitely, check it out. It's from, I think, last week's Ariel Helwani show last Wednesday. So, I would watch it. I think they have it, if you go to the YouTube channel, they have a cut down to just that section I'm talking about 16, 17 minutes. So, but find that and watch it, because I thought he did an excellent job of kind of summing up a fighter's point of view, while also, being realistic about what their options are.
What about the others that were making comments, especially Max Holloway, just ahead of his main event title fight for, I realize it's a throwaway title, BMF, but still, he was main eventing 326. And did you find him particularly bold or daring for making those comments during an interview?
Well, I mean, it would have been bold or daring several years ago, but not anymore, because other people are voicing it. I thought it was... he made some good points, but again, all the other fighters, the one common theme that runs through all these fighters is is basically their helplessness, right? That there's nothing you can do about it. The funniest one, and I thought, again, it also one of the most accurate, although probably unintentional, was Sean O'Malley, when he heard that Conor Benn is getting that much money. And it seems to be confirmed. No one has come out and said it's true, but multiple parties involved in TKO have not denied it at all, right? And if it wasn't true, you think they would have denied it. They wouldn't want anybody knowing that he's getting that kind of money. And so they're not denying it, from Dana White to Shapiro and others. And so you have to assume, based on the reporting, and again, boxing reporters, the old timers, seem to be seem to be much better at getting purse information that's accurate than when we've seen in MMA. And so when O'Malley heard it, what was his response? It was like the Homer Simpson when he went through all the phases of grief. I don't know if you ever saw that episode of The Simpsons, when he eats the poison blowfish and he's going to die, and he's, the psychiatrist is going through you're going to go through, and he goes through all the phases rapidly. That was O'Malley, because it's like, at first first he couldn't believe it. Like, no way are they paying a guy I've never heard of this much. Conor Benn obviously is a much bigger star in the UK, but Sean O'Malley never heard of him. Then there was anger voiced, because how dare they pay this guy? And I've worked my butt off to be someone that sells. And then there was some sort of acceptance, like, what are you going to do about it? And then there's some justification. This is he brings in money. That's how the UFC works. Good for them, and that was the phases, almost covered what a lot of fighters do. They justify it at the end. And that's, I'm waiting for that phase, because again, I think we mentioned this last show. This reminds me a lot of 2016. And if newer fans might not be aware what happened in 2016. In 2016, they announced the Reebok outfitter deal. Uniform deal. And so fighters before that had their own sponsors on their uniform, and the UFC had been chipping away that for years by having a sponsor tax, but still, fighters, a lot of them made more money from their sponsorship in the cage than they did from their purses. And so the UFC announced, we're getting rid of sponsorship. Now you get a set fee that Reebok's going to pay you. That was, for a lot of bigger name fighters, was just a fraction of what they're getting. And then almost immediately after the deal was announced that the fighters were losing their sponsorship to Reebok in the cage, the UFC was sold for $4 billion. And that 1-2 punch, if you were around at the time, you could really tell fighters were upset. I did a survey an article and a survey compiling fighter payouts. And I had been struggling for years to get purse information from fighters. And during a 10-week span, I got like 50, 60 fighters to share with me a lot of information that they never would have otherwise. And so you're talking about I had enough material to compile to actually put a survey together, what I thought fighters percentage wise were getting from all the different sources. And it ended up being, not 100% accurate, but pretty close when the antitrust case came out. So I'd been working on that for years, and all because that's how pissed fighters were. And right after that as well, there's all these efforts to unionize fighters and stuff. So that's 2016. But that rage only lasted a little while because, what the UFC does is they sign new fighters and the old guys retire. And for the new fighters, this is how it's always been. And so part of me wonders, because you can see there is an obvious anger amongst these fighters, frustration, but when do we get to the part where either they move on or new fighters come in, so there's no one's voicing anger anymore?
Now, during the post-fight presser for Zuffa Boxing 4, Dana White was asked about this visceral reaction to Conor Benn's purse, and he said that he thought people getting paid more was good. Do you think his answer is going to satisfy fighters?
Well, this was particularly comical in some ways, because if people remember, just a few years ago, Dana White was quoted as saying, one of the problems with boxers, those fuckers get paid too much. All those fuckers get paid too much. And so it seems like he's flipped his position here, does it not, a little bit, about boxers, that it's good that they're getting that kind of money?
Yes, it does.
Because we also have old interviews where he talked about one of the problems with boxing is when you pay them too much, they don't want to fight. So he has been heroically keeping the money down, I guess, is what he suggests. So I don't think that is going to win fighters over. I don't think it's going to quell any resentment that we're having, any uprising that we might be having amongst fighters. What kind of uprising, I kind of ponder if we should call it an uprising or not, but I don't think that's going to work. Dana White also pointed out that another comment he said is what we do in the UFC is he was prompted by someone in the media asked him this question. We, spread the wealth around and make a middle class. And I should note that's a great talking point the UFC has. I got to actually admit that's a really good talking point and argument they make, is they create a middle class for fighters. But when and that would be fine if you had kind of a middle class for fighters, except that middle class seems to be built on the back of the higher end fighters. Because what they're arguing here is that we are making sure the top guys aren't paid as much so we can spread the money around. But when you pool up the top guys, the middle guys, and the bottom guy in the UFC together, it doesn't equal what they're getting on boxing cards. We had Shakur and Teofimo Lopez just fight, right? And according to the Virgil Ortiz, something they filed, they both got $8 million for that fight. Now, that would put them in the very top of all-time payouts for UFC fighters for a one-time purse. Top of my head, going through, what I know up until, not last year, but from previous years, I know that Conor McGregor got paid more than that 4 times, right? His last 4 fights, he made more than that. But that, that should be a given. Conor McGregor generates huge amounts of money, much more money than their fight generated. I know Khabib, his last 2 fights got more. I believe I know John Jones's last fight got more. So there are 7 purses from 3 fighters.
And Brock Lesnar, right?
Well, Brock Lesnar got $8 million, the same as them. And John Jones, my understanding is when he fought Gane, got about $8 million. So 2 fighters in addition got about the same as them. Now, every other fighter in the UFC, though, I have not heard of any other fighter that got a purse that high before. Not Ilya Topuria, not anybody. So you're talking again, the very, 2 guys. Now, these guys are stars, but they're just one of many fights in the year getting that kind of purses. And in the history of boxing, the last 10 years just narrow it down to that would not even be eye-catching to some of the other purses. So the thing what the UFC does is, yes, they compress the pay of the top guys and spread the money around, but the amount of money they take from the top guys, apparently the amount of money they take from the top guys and spread around, is not the same amount. They keep a large portion of that. And so that's the kind of the hidden thing that the sleight of hand that Zuffa and UFC and Dana White, now Zuffa Boxing, it seems to be trying to play here, is that we're going to create a middle class. And how do we make this middle class? By stealing from the top and giving a small portion of that to the other guys to make this middle class while we keep the lion's share.
Now, Eddie Hearn formed a talent agency for Matchroom and signed UFC's heavyweight champion Tom Aspinall. What are we to make of this new venture?
Well, it's got a lot of attention and a lot of kind of excitement, I guess you could say, on I've seen on social media. A lot of people think this is a big deal. It means a lot, but I haven't seen anything that suggests to me it actually means a lot. Because one thing is, I noticed Eddie Hearn brings up how little Tom gets, how he should get more, and I'm not going to argue with him. I think he's right. Tom Aspinall in a more competitive market, in a market that was not as concentrated under one player, would, I believe, get a lot more. I think you'd get something more similar to what boxers are getting right now. So he's gross underpaid. But what is Eddie Hearn going to do about that? He is not representing Aspinall on the negotiations with the UFC on the fight side. There's no suggestion that they're going to challenge the contract. He's representing him on other ventures, other endeavors outside of the UFC. I'm guessing sponsorship and maybe appearances and stuff. That doesn't break the mold, and that doesn't change the dynamic between Aspinall and the UFC or other fighters. And, I know Eddie Hearn brought up that he's been contacted by a bunch of fighters, like 1,000 fighters apparently, which is in many ways sad if that's true, that are looking for representation. And a lot of people are getting excited about this, like, oh, Eddie Hearn's going to, change the game. But to me, it just has the feeling right now, unless there is something they plan on doing, unless there's an effort to challenge the UFC contracts or to maybe use the fighters to petition the British Boxing Board of Control or bring some sort of antitrust suit in Europe. Any of those, unless they do that, this seems like a PR stunt more than anything. And what people are excited about is less what it really means and more about the personality clash, the soap opera effect of Eddie Hearn versus Dana White, which people get excited about. But is there anything here that suggests there's more to it? I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, well, since fighters seem to be sort of realizing that they are not paid properly, what should they do if they don't like their pay?
Well, and yeah, this is the one we've seen a lot of discussion on this the last couple of weeks because of all the complaints about the Conor Benn, and people think, oh, this is the great time. And again, you see it suggested all the time that fighters should form a union. If you go into X or any forum, you'll see everybody's like, the fighters got to form a union. And that's just not a realistic possibility. It's not. It doesn't work for many reasons. We've done whole episodes, and I'll just do a brief summary of why it doesn't work for those that haven't listened to our previous episodes. But basically the reason it doesn't work, one is that, they can't technically collectively bargain because they're considered independent contractors. So that's eliminated. They would have to challenge their independent contractor status to become employees, in which case then they can collectively bargain. I think they should do that. I think fighters should do that. They should challenge their independent contractor status. What I think would happen is the UFC would back off on some of the demands they make to make sure that they're independent contractors. I don't think they would let fighters become employees, because one of the other issues is that there's a ruling, Three Rivers. I think I can't remember the boxer's name versus Three Rivers. It's a case in New York that involved a boxer that got brain damage and passed away in a fight, and his family sued, claiming he should get some sort of compensation, workman's comp. And the ruling was boxers, by its nature, have to be independent contractors, because basically what you're doing is you are doing mutual combat. You're agreeing to mutual combat, and the nature of the sport is to actually inflict pain and suffering on each. They actually hurt each other. That's how you win. You hurt each other. So an employee can't be responsible for you getting hurt if that's what you're agreeing to do. Under that case, it's, if you look at that as precedent in other states, it's very possible they could, they might rule that combat sports, unlike other sports, because, other sports, the nature of football is to tackle people. The nature of football is not to knock them out. That's not the purpose. That's an unintended side effect that happens all the time. But basketball, the same. The purpose of basketball is you play, you might get hurt, but your purpose is not to go out there and physically injure your opponent. That is the entire task in the boxing ring and an MMA cage. And so there's a possibility that the courts would rule and uphold this case as set in precedent that fighters have to be independent contractors. They can't be employees because employers cannot be expected to pay compensation for injuries that are inherent to the task, the job. So there's that problem. And then on top of it, the biggest one, I think, too, is that fighting is a zero-sum game, as sad as it is. To get fighters to work together, people say they're selfish. But there is no win-win in fighting because literally two people get in the cage, one beats the other guy. That is a zero-sum situation right there. And if you look at the entire MMA grouping of fighters, the other problem is that fight combat sports as a whole, the history of it is the top guy, the champion, gets most of the money, power, wealth. There's only one champion. Only one person can be the champion at a time in a weight class, technically. And so, again, it boils down to a zero-sum environment where no one's going to want to work together because only one person can win. So it creates an environment that's hard to get these guys to work together. And if they do, the UFC's specifically set up to break any sort of labor stoppage. There's 42 events per year. All they need is basically 20 fighters per card to cross the line. And if you follow, the stick and ball sports that everybody says all the fighters just got to strike like the other sports don't go on strike anymore. And the reason they don't go on strike is because strikes don't work, because they realized that in the NFL in the 80s, they went on strike twice, and very quickly fighters start crossing the line, not fighters, but players start crossing the line. And that's in a situation where you have every team playing on a weekend, so you only have to have a percentage of the whole league not playing, and you'd shut it down. Here, a very small percentage of currently under contract fighters would have to cross the line to hold an event, and you throw in the pool of fighters desperate to get in, it'd just be impossible to do any sort of labor stoppage. So for all those reasons, you add them up, creating a union is not just technically impossible, very much just basically impossible. So what are the options? What should they do? Should they sign with Eddie Hearn? Is he going to lead them and do something? Maybe he has some plans. It doesn't look that way. But it seems to me what fighters got to realize is if they want to get more, if they want to get paid like the boxers they see are getting paid, right? What they got to do is introduce competition into their sport. And how do you get competition? There's only kind of two ways, I think, and I've seen so far in combat sports to introduce competition. Introduce an environment that would allow other promotions to spring up and challenge them. And one is the antitrust suit they have ongoing. And there's legislation like the Ali Act, which created a much more competitive market in boxing by preventing monopoly. So those are the two. So what can fighters do? I would suggest one is we have an antitrust suit going on right now. It was this whole thing about discovery, right? Where Dana White apparently lost his messages and they don't know if they're relevant or not. I have not heard, and maybe there has been, but I have not heard of a single fighter volunteer to the plaintiff and say, I have messages from Dana White negotiating with me that kind of disprove his testimony, him or Hunter Campbell or anybody. That's a simple thing. If fighters were serious of getting in an environment which is much more competitive, you think they would be contacting the plaintiffs or the plaintiff's attorney and saying, let me help you. And the simple way I can help you is I can just offer the material I have access to, text messages, inform my manager to please hand over any messages related to me in the UFC, anything to help their case. Right? Because you've strengthened the plaintiff's case, there is a chance not only of additional money in settlement, but there's a chance the judge could order injunctive relief. There's a chance that the Phil Davis case could be stronger and get injunctive relief. So there's all these things could potentially help the environment for fighters to have a more competitive market. But right now, a small select group of fighters, the named plaintiffs, right now you can just name off on one hand, basically Tristan Connolly, Cajun Johnson, CB Dalloway, Phil Davis, and Misha Serkinov are the only ones challenging the system right now. We had the Lee case, had some other guys, but the current group, those five. So fighters could assist them in that. And the other possibility is Phil Davis might not have standing. There's that issue. Is there any fighter in place to take his spot if the judge says he doesn't have standing? Well, if you hope to have a more competitive landscape, if you hope the judge grants some injunctive relief and creates a much more competitive market, well, then you better hope there's someone to replace Phil Davis if he gets removed, right? So that's the other thing. If a fighter thinks he could fill that spot, if he is someone that does not have, I think the requirement would be that you cannot have been part of the league class action and that you do not have an arbitration agreement in the UFC. If you fit that, and I probably want a top fighter as well, ranked fighter on the fight matrix or whatever, then, they could be calling and say, I am here in case you guys need me. So those are possibilities on that end. On the other side, Zuffa Boxing right now is going to amend the Ollie Act to a point where introducing a MMA expansion of the Ollie Act would be pointless. So something simple, fighters are willing to voice on talk shows about their displeasure with the current pay structure. Why don't they get together and write a letter, right, with the biggest names? If you took all the people that have recently complained, Sean Strickland, Israel Adesanya, Sean O'Malley, John Jones, Aljamain Sterling, just go down there, like, I guess, Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor. Those are some of the biggest stars. Some of them, there's current champions and former champions that are currently at the top of the sport. That might have an impact if they wrote a letter, right? They had a letter signed with their names on it that said, not only do we oppose the new bill that's going to gut the Ollie Act, but we also want to think that Congress should extend it to MMA. Right. That would probably do more than all these other kind of, fantastical suggestions people give that, fighters just have to get better management. Fighters just, all go on strike. Those are not really realistic. What is realistic is, like, there's an opportunity now. Congress is looking at it, say, hey, we do not agree with the current bill. And not only on top of that, we want to suggest a different version that actually has input from us fighters. That's, the people the bill is supposed to impact. Here is our suggestion. And it's going to be harder to ignore if it's the biggest names in the currently the biggest names in the sport suggesting it. So those would be, those are really my only suggestions right now, because those, they're not perfect, but those are the ones I think would have plausibly the best chance of having some sort of outcome that would improve the environment for fighters, where it's a more competitive landscape. Of course, we get back to the whole thing that fighters and fans, in some ways, don't seem like they want a competitive landscape. But if that's the case, then you're not going to get any additional pay.
Let's talk about Zuffa Boxing, because they were at the center of a big kerfuffle over the weekend and all last week with the IBF, because J.O. Patea had the IBF belt. He was supposed to be defending it along with the ring belt. I mean, there was just this whole thing because the Zuffa Boxing belt was on the line. Supposedly, reports came out that said that supposedly the IBF took in $80,000 in sanctioning fees and then didn't sanction the fight. Can you sort of lay out all the ins and outs of this and how sanctioning fees work?
Well, I can lay it out as much as I was able to glean from various media, various reporters, Dan Raphael, namely. And so what had happened is that IBF apparently had agreed to sanction this fight as a cruiserweight championship bout, world championship for the IBF, International Boxing Federation title. And at the same time, the UFC, not the UFC, I've got to keep using it. I'm going to have to get used to this. Zuffa Boxing of TKO, they were going to crown their first Zuffa Boxing champion. Now, two different versions, and they probably are both accurate, of what happened. One is IBF were offended what they thought they were slights towards them, that maybe their official wasn't treated properly, that they thought that the Zuffa Boxing was given too much prominence and that there was not enough prominence given to the IBF belt. And so that's the argument, that one reason that they basically throw a fit, left, and said, we're not going to sanction this fight. Then they released a letter, and their argument was that under the rules, they can only sanction a bout with another sanctioned organization title that follows the rules of, basically federal legislation. And actually both kind of work together. Both could possibly be true. Now, I think IBF made a mistake, at least appearance-wise, by not making it clear early on, like, here are the requirements we're going to have to sanction this fight, because it does seem like it was a last-minute decision. Like, how did you miss that there was going to be what a Zuffa Boxing title is? Did you do no research? It does have that. On the other hand, it's understandable that they might not want to sanction. I know a lot of guys are saying, the Zuffa Boxing title doesn't mean anything. It doesn't. There's no reason why IBF couldn't sanction that bout. But from IBF's point of view, I guess you could say, or just look at it, IBF is required under federal law to follow certain rules as a sanctioning organization. And amongst them is they have to have, at least according to the Ali Act, is not fully followed, objective rankings. Their rankings cannot be closed to any individual because of the promoter they have or the management. So they have to be open to all fighters, their rankings and their chance for the title. And they have to then file with the FTC. When you look at Zuffa Boxing, people were trying to claim, Zuffa Boxing is not a sanctioning organization. It's not a real title. I even saw Dan Raphael say it's a trophy under federal law. And I'm like, I'm still waiting to see which federal law he's referring to. The whole idea it's a trophy is a sleight of hand that Zuffa has played for years, Zuffa being the UFC in this case, the parent company. During the BJ Penn case years ago, when BJ Penn left with the UFC title, he claimed as the championship, he had an inherent right to it. And Zuffa said, no, it's not a real title. It is a trophy. And then, of course, Lawrence Epstein supposedly told Mark Wayne Mullen when they met when the Ali Expansion Act was going through, that our titles aren't real titles. They're trophies we give to the best fighter of the night. And so why does UFC argue that? Why do they do that for their titles? Because a couple reasons is, one is, they're afraid, I guess, that someone would apply statutes of the Ali Act and other boxing legislation and regulations and precedent against them, because if it's an actual title, them as a promoter under the Ali Act, which doesn't apply to MMA, but maybe they're afraid someone will apply it or cite it in some unique way that that it would be applied. Promoter cannot. Theoretically, a promoter can't have their own title. There can't be compensation between the promoter and the sanctioning organization, all these things. And on top of that, in boxing, titles and ratings are those are a property right. Ever since the Duva v. WBC case, I believe it was in 82 or something like that, that case ruled that the fighters have a right to their ranking, have a right to their title. In other words, it's owned by them. The rules can dictate they lose the title, but you cannot willy-nilly strip them on a whim because they earned that. And so I think their fear then for the UFC as well was, we don't want our titles considered titles because we like the ability to strip fighters whenever we want. We don't feel the need that a fighter can own it if they leave the UFC. And so for Zuffa Boxing, that's what they're kind of trying to claim. They're trying to do the same thing. And you look at their titles. Well, will the title be defendable? Will the fighter that wins the Zuffa Boxing title, can he defend it? Yes, I'm sure they will do the same trick that UFC does, is where they started to do at one point, is every time a fighter wins a belt, they would give them a new belt. And the probable reasoning of that is then we can pretend it's a trinket because you get a new title every time you fight. But is the championship you win, do you defend it? Well, yes. Okay. That sounds like a sanctioned title. Do your pay, is that impacted? Is your contract impacted by you being the Zuffa champion? If you look at the contracts we've seen, Zuffa champions get paid more. When you're promotions champion, your pay goes up. Zuffa champions are bound by a championship clause. So the title seems to have some importance. So it would seem like the Zuffa Boxing is trying to operate as a sanctioned organization, treating it like a sanctioned organization title, but not following the rules that you're federally required. So I can understand why IBF would be hesitant, would not want to endorse a unification bout with a title that for all practical purposes is acting like a sanctioning or title, but is not following the rules under legislation of, you can't have the compensation between a promoter and the sanction organization. Well, in this case, you own it. There's some financial interest there. You have to have it open to all fighters. It can't be exclusive to any promotion or manager. Well, here it's only for Zuffa Boxing. They're just breaking the law right now, technically. And so I can understand why they wouldn't want to agree to that. But I think the way they might have went about it didn't work out well. But I think the people that do not see the issue with the Zuffa title, I think they're willfully ignorant on that, because it's obvious that they're trying to operate as a sanctioned organization without having to comply with the requirements as a sanctioned organization. They will have a way to get around it when the UBO portion of the bill gets passed, if it gets passed, but it hasn't been passed yet. So that's the situation there. Now, you were asking about the fees. Well, that's one thing, and I should stress this. I hate the idea of the UFC, TKO, Zuffa Boxing, whatever, getting the Ali Act amended in a way that guts it and lets them operate like the UFC does in boxing. I think that's terrible. It eliminates competition. And if you do that, you'll lower purses, lower the leverage of fighters, the athletes. I think that's terrible. But at the same time, the sanctioning organization system is pretty freaking terrible as well, right? And so I would love, and we've done whole shows, we've had Kurt Emhoff on here talking about changes we'd love to do to boxing. I would love to amend the Ali Act and put some better strength, regulate the hell out of the sanction organizations, or introduce new bodies to replace them. But this new bill, it kind of introduces the worst of both worlds, because what the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act does, it says, well, one is we're not going to eliminate the current model. So if you think the sanction organizations are awful and terrible, as TKO officials say repeatedly, that they're a disaster, guess what? We're going to keep this terrible, evil, corrupt system in place that people can work under that if they choose, or they can choose to work under the UFC model, which has been accused of antitrust violations in multiple lawsuits. What the fuck is that? What choice is that? You got your option is, okay, you can either get hit in the back of the head with a hammer or get hit in the face with a baseball bat. That's the shitty, there's no fix there. So that's terrible. But to get back to the sanction organizations, so they're not going to, the bill's not going to fix that. But the sanction organizations are somewhat hard to defend, because they do stuff like, everybody's aware that the sanction organizations charge a 3% fee to purses, right? Which gets usually paid after the bout. They have on the contract all the revenue sources they can track down, so you have to give them access to that. That's a given. But the sanctioning organizations also have multiple other fees that they just nitpick at constantly, right? And there's a promoter annual registration. If you're going to work with them as a promoter, you got to send them. I'm going to use the IBF. Some of the others are worse. But for the IBF, you have to mail them a check for $5,000 every year. That's your promoter annual registration fee. If you're going to do an IBF men's world title bout, well, depending on the weight class and the combined purse, there's an additional sanctioning fee. So this fight was a cruiserweight fight, and I'm sure the purse was somewhat up there. It might have been $25,000 fee. When's that paid? Well, I believe that might be one of the payments that they're talking about. They already paid. That they might have paid the sanctioning fee already. The promoter sanctioning fee, not the fighter's 3%, the promoter sanctioning fee. So that's $25,000 plus their $5,000 annual fee. Because if Zuffa Boxing is promoting this event, they've never worked with the promoters before. They probably had to mail that in. So right there's $30,000. Then there's the fees that they have to pay for the referees and the judges and the supervisor that goes, because sanctioned organizations oversee those. That's something that the Muhammad Ali, the Professional Boxing Amendment Act would have fixed, but they decided not to run with that. They decided to run with this new bill. Then there's, for heavyweight bouts, it's an additional fee. Eliminators have a fee. There's fees on everything. So I don't know where the total 60,000 comes from. I'm guessing
it's 80,000.
Oh, 80,000. I'm sorry, 80,000. I'm guessing it is the annual fee they paid, because they had to, I'm sure they hadn't paid it before. It's the $25,000 bout sanctioning fee, and probably my guess is it's for the judges and referee fees, maybe paid in advance, were mailed out there, or it could be, it could also be that you have to supply a large number of tickets and flights. It could have been that. So there's a lot of different things. The fee could be, and so I can only do guesswork what it is, but I'm guessing. I'm pretty sure it's probably the annual fee and the bout sanctioning fee, and then either it's the judges' referee fees maybe were sent in already, or it's the things like the per diems, hotels, plane tickets, and event tickets, access to buying the events tickets. So it might have been all those instead. So 80,000 still sounds pretty high before the bout, but. But that's where we're at. Yep.
People were assuming that the 80K was what the fighter would have paid after the event, the regular order of things. But because Mike Coppinger was the one to break this quote, and I'm using my heavy sarcastic air quotes, because he was the one to break this news, working for Ring Magazine and Turkey Al Sheikh, people seem to think that it was manufactured news. Could that be?
That is manufactured news? Yes, very much. Are you talking about, or could it be that it's the fighters' purses that are part of it?
No.
That seems
meaning that they just like manufactured this news. Oh, IBF already collected the fighters' fees already.
Maybe. I mean, it is possible. Here's another possibility. You want to put on some tinfoil hat. It is conceivable they thought they might run into some problems with the IBF and sent them the fees just so they could make the idea.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!